Our scripture reading this morning will come from Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 through 15. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out in this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him. What are we? Your complaining is not against us, but is against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, 'Draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining.'" And Aaron has spoken. And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening quails came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as on the frost of the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." And this is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Two introductory remarks. I'm just now realizing that I'm not making a fashion statement. I just simply forgot to put on the stole. So just know that. I heard the bells ringing and the music playing, and I thought I got to get out, and I just forgot to put it on. So there we go. Just want you to be aware of that. Secondly, because it doesn't fit into the sermon anywhere, but because I thought it was just an interesting thing. When I just read, and it said, when the Israelites saw this flaky substance that looked like frost on the ground, they said, "What is it?" The Hebrew phrase there is manhu. That means, what is it? And it's interesting that whatever it is ended up being called manna. Right? So it's a play on words. So it's sort of like we would do, remember the candy bar, whatchamacallit? Or, that's basically what it is. What is it? Yes, that's what it is. We don't know. That's just interesting to me. When you're on Jeopardy, now you'll know what that means. All right, now for the real sermon. There's nothing about college that's easy for anybody. But I came to learn that being a music education major was, one of those at the top of the list. Might surprise, but that's what it is. I mean, the idea, I don't know of an area that is so broad. I mean, on my certificate, on my diploma, you can see it in my office, it says music education K through 12. So that means that any instrument that any kid will touch between kindergarten and when they graduate high school, I should be able to know something about and to teach them. Can you imagine that? That just seems impossible. As a result, in college, I had to take a lot of classes. I had to, again, have some sort of a working knowledge of every instrument that seemingly existed. Now, if you're a normal college kid, a very intense semester would be one in which you have 18 hours of classes, right? That's kind of the general understanding of the max. And given that each class is about 3 hours, that would put you roughly at about 6 classes for 18 hours. Again, that's a hard semester. There was one semester where I had 13 classes for 18 hours. Because a lot of the music classes were just 1 hour credits. Unfortunately, they did not give you 1 hour's credit worth of work. They were a lot more than that. So that was a rough couple months. And there were other times when things were difficult. Yet it's interesting when I think back, and once I graduated and once I started teaching music in Rocky Mount, there were days when I thought, if I could just go back to college. It wasn't so bad. Those first couple, any teacher will know, but especially beginning teachers, those first couple years are just hard, right? I'm a pretty big guy, and I had a pretty big beard, and I'm like, there's no way that 5-year-olds should be not intimidated by me, but they weren't. They knew how to boss me around. It was just, no grown man should feel the way they felt for those 2 years. My 3rd year of teaching, as I've said before, was quite good, and so there's that. All right, so again, school was hard. Teaching was hard, but I said, if I could just go back to school. The thing is, when I started seminary, especially that spring semester of my first year, oh man, I thought teaching was hard. And this was hard. And you should have heard me in my mind driving back and forth to Durham from Rocky Mount. There were days when I would say, if I could just go back to teaching, life would be so much easier. It's just so easy to forget. You can romanticize the past with such ease. Everything was better the way it used to be, even though things were always worse. There was always there was no time period that anybody's ever lived that was perfect and idyllic, but we convince ourselves of that. I'm going to use a metaphor throughout this sermon, and I hope that it works, and I hope you get it. We're going to use some song metaphors, and we'll see how it plays out. Pun intended. I did it accidentally to Suzanne earlier, and I thought, I'll do it on purpose this time. Here's the metaphor. Singing songs of the past, even if they're bad ones, is easier and preferred over learning new ones. That's the problem that Israel had to learn. And that's the problem that we're seeing them learn sort of in person as we're reading these stories. Israel must be trained to learn new songs. No matter how much they romanticize the past ones, they're not good. They weren't good. And God is trying to teach them a new way. With training, hopefully instead of singing romanticized, false songs about the past, they will be able to sing new and glorious songs. Some that maybe have a refrain like, "Morning by morning, new mercies I see." Now, again, as you know, if you've been following along at all, we've been looking at the story of the Exodus. The last 2 weeks, we've camped in a couple pretty important sections of the book. The first was in chapter 12, and that's where we were able to see the Passover festival institutionalized. What was stressed in those passages, in that passage, in Exodus 12, was remembrance. Remember what the Lord your God has done. That festival helped us transition into last week's reading where we talked about Exodus 14. That's when the Israelites actually walked through the waters. And sort of, we use the imagery of Genesis 1 to help us understand it. Just as Genesis 1, we saw the waters being separated so that dry land could appear. So in Exodus 14, the waters were separated, dry land appeared, and the Israelites could walk through them on their way to new life. Last week's story was a sort of new creation story. And just as the old creation emphasized God's ability to bring about life and his ability to work for goodness, so that's what we talked about. And we talked about this, the Israelites passing through the waters was so that they could experience the new life that God had provided. And so they could see that the Lord their God was good and was deserving of glory. We also stressed in each of these 2 sermons that Israel was saved for a purpose. The end of the story was not to just get them out of Egypt. If that was the case, our book would have ended at Exodus 14 or 15. Israel was saved for a purpose. They had work to do. The work was to bring all the nations back into God's communal presence. That's the promise that was given to Abraham. That's the promise that Israel will be working out. Israel was saved for the sake of rescuing the world. Now that world rescue is going to take a little bit of time. As we saw last week, the Israelites were staring in the face of the chaotic and deathly waters in front of them. But when they turned around to look, they saw the menacing march of the Egyptians behind them. There was nowhere to turn. Death surrounded them in front and in behind, and the people began to lose control. And so they said things to Moses like, "Did you bring us out here to die? Were there not enough graves in Egypt that we had to come out here to be buried in the wilderness?" Now last week when we talked about that, I said, let's take a step back and be a little bit sympathetic. Let's show generosity and gentleness with this sort of reaction. Because, as we said, it's not clear exactly how much these Israelites, who had spent 400 years in Egypt and however many of those years in slavery, it's not clear how much these people were familiar with the God of Israel. I can't remember if I said it last week, but if I didn't, it's appropriate here. That in the early chapters of Exodus, it never says that these Israelites prayed to God and he heard them. The only thing it says is that the Israelites groaned and God heard them. It's just interesting that there's no direct connection between the Israelites and God. The one who initiated that connection was God when he spoke to Moses through the burning bush. Just interesting. And again, I don't want to read too much into that, but I think that's somewhat significant. I think the Israelites don't really know exactly what God is capable of. They don't really know what's possible. Maybe we could even say they don't really know what they will be used for at this point. I think that fits within the narrative of Exodus. And so, as we said, the wilderness was their classroom. And now Israel is just beginning to learn what God is capable of, who he is, and who they are. But just as we showed generosity and gentility to the Israelites last week, I'm asking us to do the same at least one more week. Again, I know they're grumbling again. And I know they just walked through the waters, and so this should seem pretty self-explanatory, but maybe we could think of it this way. God has shown that he is able to show up in important situations. All right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But will God be able to show up in the ordinary day-to-day type of life? Is God concerned about something like that? Again, in the experience of these Israelites, they don't know. And so they learn. Now on top of that, here's sort of the background. I don't know the Jewish calendar very well. I don't know how to add up the days and everything else like that. But for those who are smart enough and have studied their way of life, you might recall that in Exodus 12, when it gives you the Passover, it tells you what day you're supposed to start. If you read verse 1, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, it tells the reader what day it is. And for those who are smart enough to know how to count all that, the Israelites are roughly 30 days or so from the time they left Egypt. So that's where we are at the beginning of Exodus 16. We're about 30 days. We're about a month out of the time living in Egypt. And if you recall that there was a moment where God told the Israelites to get some goods from the Egyptians. Get some resources. Get some food. But again, we're about 30 days in. I mean, I don't know how much you all camp, but how many of you ever take 30 days worth of food materials with you, right? That would be a hard thing to do. So I just imagine, and I'm getting this from one ancient writer, that it seems like a likely explanation for this is that the stores and the resources that they had packed before they left are soon to be, if not already, exhausted. And now the Israelites are wondering, well, okay, here we are in the middle of nowhere. Believe it or not, Marshall, there's not a Piggly Wiggly in sight. I mean, how terrible is that? Even Dollar Generals had not made it to the Sinai Peninsula just yet. So the people are wondering, how will we take care of ourselves? And because of that, because they look around and see the barrenness of wilderness, they start singing a song. So I'm going to put the Israelites' words that they spoke to Moses in song, poetic, half-sonnet form. All right, so this is it. Were we brought out here only to die? Oh, how we long for our Egyptian home. A land happy enough, with a few sighs, but more than ever a return home. a return is welcome. Better to die in stomach, I messed it up. Better to die with full stomachs in chain than in this wilderness without any grain. Thank you. I would like to read that again sometime without the mistakes, but you get the idea. Now, one of the interesting features of this song, so to speak, is that it's not met by God with anger and ridicule. Anger will come after a point. We know the Old Testament enough to know that. But in these early stages of learning, Israel, again, is just now trying to figure out who God is and who they are as a result of who God is. What God is trying to teach them in this moment is that who they are is beloved. Who they are is cared for. Who God is provider. Who God is I am. Again, this is a verb that just means being, always. God is I am, and he is the one, as a result of that was always with them and will always fight for them, as we talked about last week. Now, just as in those first days of creation, God's presence and power were made known through those repetitions of evening and morning, so now God says his presence will be made known by providing meat in the evenings and bread in the mornings. And this stands in stark contrast to the character Pharaoh that they have spent most of their time with. The Pharaoh never heard their cries for help. The Pharaoh always refused their cries for release. In contrast, Yahweh shows that he hears their cries and therefore shows himself worthy of worship. God shows them that this pattern of gathering food in the evenings and mornings have a purpose. Again, this stands in stark contrast to the Pharaoh and his work. First, God's work there are two things that God's work seeks to accomplish. One is that, as it says in verse 6 and verse 12 of the passage that we read, you shall know that I am the Lord your God. God's provision is supposed to lead to knowledge. That repetition of daily being provided in the evening and in the morning is so that they will know that I am the Lord your God. And secondly, they say, you shall see the glory of God. And that's in verse 7. Again, God is trying to teach them that they were more than slave labor. They were made for more than slave labor. They have so long lived under the tutelage of Pharaoh that they now lack what we might call, in fanciful terms, is a vocational imagination. Or to state it more plainly, they don't know what they were created for. They don't know the purposes that God had given them for the world. And now God is trying to teach them. Again, they've lived under Pharaoh's rule for so long, but now they live under God's. Whereas before, Pharaoh told them to work and what their work was for, namely serving him, God now shows them that his work is providing for them. God provided for them food so that they could work more, produce more. God provides them food so that they can rest more in God's presence. Pharaoh wanted them to know his power and his glory by means of oppression. Yahweh wants to show his glory by means of provision. So for all of this and more, instead of turning to the Israelites in anger when they complain, God himself provides without complaint. They shall know who God is by the continual pattern of collecting food. Daily bread is meant to lead to daily trust. New patterns are meant to lead to new life. The rituals of God are to destroy the rituals they learned in Egypt. And as a result, a new people is formed. Perhaps, too, those romanticized songs about the past, which conveniently forget the cruelties, can lead to something new, a new sort of song. New mercies will lead to new songs about those mercies and the God who provides them. Now, Israel is going to have its ups and downs. Some days they get what God is doing and they join in. Others, they don't. Well, let's be honest. Most of the time they don't. But let's be even more honest. Most of the time, we don't. If this weren't a sermon, if this weren't a church service, this were more like a Bible study, and we were sitting around tables, what I would like to do is have everybody break off. I would give you, as a table, questions to talk about. So now think about, your sections here. If you all got together in a little circle, and I asked you to discuss these things, what would your answers be? Can you look your table mates in the eyes and answer with honesty that you spent this last week reading the scriptures, praying, serving where you could, just pondering the things of God more than you spent watching television, on the internet, or whatever the case might be? Right? Can we look each other honestly and say, I have done more faithful things than I have done unfaithful things? I'm imagining if I really asked you all to tell each other how much you messed up, we would all just sit and look each other in silence because we wouldn't want to admit it. We might just all nod our heads and say, okay, we're all the same. Right? We've all done that. That all applies to us. Now, again, it's not that those things of watching television, watching news, or doing other sort of leisure activities, it's not that those things are bad in and of themselves. The problem comes when we make those things our daily patterns. When we make those things our daily songs. Because the simple truth is, whatever we put in is going to be that which comes out. Right? If we keep listening to the bad songs, we will keep singing the bad songs. Again, for those teachers in the rooms, how often have you heard little kids say things that they should not have said in a school setting? And the reason is because that's what's being filtered into them. And they don't know what to do other than those things that they have been taught. Now, again, we can be taught to do bad things by others. That happens for sure. But we can be taught ourselves because we listen to the wrong songs. I was once studying Revelation with a group of people, and if you know anything about Revelation, there are a lot of images of death and destruction, and again, while it's all arcing toward, it's all leaning toward, bending toward something good and glorious, there's just a sense of honesty about the book. Sometimes people of faith get caught up in the death and destruction. Sometimes it is their faith which is the cause of that death and destruction, which is why there's the repeated refrain throughout the book of Revelation to maintain faithfulness. Be like the faithful witness, Jesus himself, who was faithful unto death. We too should be faithful in that sort of way. But I remember in this study there was a person that kept coming back with the refrain, something to the effect of, we just can't understand or appreciate the good we have if we don't experience the bad. And I get that saying, and that was one of those things that I never really came back and said anything to, in part because the book of Revelation is so strange, and there's always times that I felt like I was always saying, well, maybe that's not quite the way we should think about it. I was doing a whole lot of corrections. I didn't feel like that was one I needed to address then. But when I think about it now, I kind of wish I would go back and say something a little bit different. Because just think about how the Bible begins. The Bible begins with a display of God's goodness. And following that display of goodness, we get to Genesis 3 and get to see what a display of badness is. In other words, we don't know the good because we experience the bad. We know what is bad because we have experienced good. That's the way that works. And I think that's what God is wanting to call the Israelites to. Know the good songs so that you avoid the bad ones. Know the good acts of faith so you avoid the wrong acts of faithlessness. It's in knowing goodness that we can avoid what is bad. Yet again, we as people of faith, is that the pattern we're putting into our daily lives? That we are focusing first and foremost on the good, on what God is, who God is, on what His kingdom looks like? Or are we jumping too early to the badness and trying to focus on that? I think the answer is that we as people of faith too often ignore the goodness of God. We let ourselves be consumed by the badness around us. And so the unfaithful and undesirable expressions of faith we see in the world are the natural result. What goes in must come out. Israel is in the process of learning God's good character. They show at times glimpses of understanding. Now, we didn't read about it. It wasn't in the set of lectionary texts. But if you were to go home and start reading along and reading the verses that we're not reading in this church service, if you started at 12 and get to chapter 16, you would have noticed there's a stark change in chapter 15. That once the Israelites cross the waters, they themselves sing a song. And it's a glorious song. It's a wonderful song of praise, a wonderful song of thanksgiving. It's a hymn that helps the Israelites know, but also is sort of a way of preparing the world that you will need to reckon with this good God that has rescued us from Egypt. Singing that song was a good and right thing to do. But it didn't take long for them to forget. At the end of chapter 15, it seems like just once their song is ending, they're starting to look around and see that they don't have any water to drink. The only waters present are bitter. What are they to do? Well, they sing a song of complaint. And God shows up, and He makes a way to make the water good. Then we get to chapter 16. They walk around, well, now we're out of food. So they sing another song of complaint. And yet God again sings a response of goodness and provision. At some point, I think the idea we're supposed to get at is, all right, these responsive songs of provision, which should themselves lead to wonderful songs and hymns of thanksgiving and praise, those should be the words and ideas and melodies we have dancing in our heads. Those good songs will lead to good rhythms and good rhymes that will lead to sharing something beautiful with the world around them. The world around us. I mean, in a world of darkness, is it ever possible to have too many good songs? In this world of darkness, we need more songs to provide light and maybe even possibility. Maybe a command here would be, adorn the dark with songs of light and goodness, so that we ourselves can remember who God is, so that we can remember who we are, but also so that the world may know the glory of our God. I like that phrase, adorning the dark. And I wish I would say I was smart enough and clever enough to come up with it. But it was actually the title of a book I read this week. It was written by a singer, songwriter, novelist named Andrew Peterson. He's written some wonderful and beautiful music. And written some fantasy books that I haven't read yet, but are on top of my list of things I want to get. But he told a story that as he was traveling around the country doing his shows, doing his concerts and stuff, after one of the shows, a woman came to him and she bought his CD back in the day when people bought CDs. And she brought it to him and asked if he could do two things. One, sign it. Two, she said that she was an aspiring songwriter. And if he could give her just some short advice and write that down on the CD cover as well, she would be greatly appreciative. So Andrew Peterson did. He signed his name and he wrote this advice. Don't write bad songs. I mean, simple enough. And the funny thing about it is, I mean, the whole book, Adorning the Dark, is about the importance of the endeavor for Christians, wherever they find themselves, to work and create beauty wherever we are. Not just as an artist, but, simple things. He mentions his wife, who continually beautifies the home, always has candles burning so it smells good. And a sort of creativity. It's a sort of beauty. So, I mean, there are a lot of different ways that we can be artistic in that sense. And so, because he was stressing this idea of beauty, because it's something that he had consumed himself with throughout his life, I mean, it makes sense that he would say, don't write bad songs. Aim for the good ones. Well, this girl, this woman, I don't know how old she was, she went to one of Andrew Peterson's friends, another singer-songwriter. And she asked him the same questions. Can you sign your name, and can you give me some advice? And so the friend looked over and saw what his friend Andrew had written, don't write bad songs. And so the other friend wrote a response. Write the bad ones too. I think that's a good mandate to try to figure out how to live in the world of songwriting, right? Nobody's going to be perfect their first time around. If you've ever tried to write a song of any capacity, it's one of those things that writing anything, sermons or anything, you write something and you think, okay, I got something. And then you go back and read it and your next response is, this is the worst thing ever. And then you got to try to work on it. It's like a clay statue, right? You got to keep working to mold this statue into something beautiful. Songwriting is like that. Book writing is like that. Anything is like that. Any sort of creating is like that. So I think it's good advice to have both of those things together. Yeah, don't write the bad songs. Try your best to make the best possible thing. But write the bad ones too. In part because the thing that might be bad at the beginning could be something that could be worked on and turned into something good, right? The bad can be redeemed at times. And even if the individual songs can't be redeemed, you make an effort to try something. And if it can't be anything other than bad, a person learns from their mistakes so that the next thing they try to write might be just a little bit better. So again, whether you're redeeming the bad or learning from the bad, which is itself a type of redemption, it's a good word, it's a good phrase to put both of those things together. Don't write bad songs, but write the bad ones too. Because it can't do anything but lead to something better. But I think that mandate for songwriting can become sort of a parable for Christian living. The life of faith is sort of like songwriting. I'm sure this past week we've all written a few bad songs with our life. I confess that the Wednesday night Bible study, that I shook my fist to the heavens because it rained an hour before we were about to start, when it didn't seem like rain was coming at any point in the day. It was not the best song I've ever written. But it's a mistake. And as a mistake, it's an opportunity to learn. Again, just like in songwriting, mistakes can be redeemed. It would have been better that Israel had never sung songs of complaint. It would have been better if I had never shaken my fist to the heavens. But these are each opportunities to learn, because once I got to our place at the farm, we realized it wasn't that wet there. It rained here, but not there. Who knew that God could do something like that? The Israelites learned that, God provides in the big way. He can separate the water so that they can walk through on dry land. But also God can also provide with their daily needs. The complaints are not needed. God will provide. Not only will God provide, we see that God provides with a sense of abundance. Everybody always had what they needed, whether the families were large or small. They had what they needed. So again, they were learning to live faithfully. God is asking us to do the same thing. To learn to live faithfully in the little moments. And again, it's easy to say to anybody, just do the right thing. Pray the right prayer. Sing the right song. And I wish I could do that more often. But, like creating something, the spiritual life is a work of art. It's a craft. It takes time. It takes skill. It takes discipline. It takes all those things. And I really do. I want my life to be like one of those songs that you hear and you instantly know, this is beautiful. And I can't imagine a world where this song, this thing of beauty, never existed. And for those who hear this song forever and ever, their lives will continually be changed by these tunes and melodies and words. I want my life to be like that. I imagine that you want your life to be like that. If only our lives could be like the songs that play in the darkness and bring light. But what I'm wanting to say is that we might write bad songs time and again. And I don't want us to ever shrug our shoulders and just say, well, that's who I am. Just a bad songwriter, just a bad follower of Jesus. Yeah, I mean, we're all bad in some sense. But what I'm wanting to say is that there's always room to get better. Israel will learn to sing better songs. If for no other reason, because there was an Israelite who sang the most perfect song, namely the person of Jesus. And as a result of that, this Jesus has given us his Spirit so that the songs of Jesus can be sung around the world and also in the grand places and in the grand halls like Carnegie Hall in New York, and also in the small places like Pine Tops. Of course, if I could give you an urge, don't write the bad songs that Israel wrote. But if you do write a bad song, work on it. Allow God to redeem it. Again, it's a craft. It's an art that takes practice. It takes discipline. If we sing the bad songs, then sing a song of forgiveness. If we sing a song of grumbling, may it be one that actually turns into an understanding of faith. Right? We're all going to do bad, but may they be taken as learning opportunities. Because even in our grumblings, in our sinfulness, in our rebellions, God shows time and time again throughout the scriptures that the only song he really knows is one of graciousness and abundance. And sometimes within songs, you can even find an appropriate moment of silence. Silence is a great response to the wondrous things that God has done and accomplished in our lives. So sing the songs of faith. Now again, maybe it's best to say, or maybe it's best to ponder, that we're never solitary songwriters. We never have to think about writing the first song. God always writes the songs. And in some sense, God is just saying, can I write my song in you? Can you be the melody that changes the hearts of the people? Can you be the melody that adorns the dark? Can you be the melody that goes out into the world so that everybody may know that I am Yahweh, their God? Can you be the song sung by which the world will know my glory? In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.